So yes, this is a summary of section 3 to 7 of the chapter 1 of the Survey of Buddhism. So in a way, what these early sections are doing is they're kind of blowing your mind. They're blowing open your the limitations of your mind, blowing open into this expanded universe and seeing the Buddha and the Buddha's achievement within that expanded universe. And section 3 is, in a way, it's blowing your mind as to the world you live in. And the beings that exist in the world that you're living. It's blowing apart your idea of space. And I suppose one of the main messages we get from section 3 is that devas exist. So we've got this expanded context. There's higher life forms, there's lower life forms, there's what Sangharakshita calls a magnificent panorama of beings. And within all of this, man, as in human, is axial, because in all of these sort of magnificent panorama of many beings, within that you have the possibility of human consciousness. And within human consciousness, it's possible that something can emerge that's beyond all forms of existence. And the thing that can emerge within human consciousness is the Buddha. So yes, human beings are axial. Human consciousness is axial, but also mankind is not the highest life form, because there's other more refined beings, devas, in other words. And he says, how poor and narrow in comparison is scientific history. The Buddha, enlightenment, meditation, supramundane states of consciousness, psychic powers, and supernormal beings are all reduced to scientific theory based on prejudice and preconceived ideas. You know, in the time that he was writing, modern Buddhist commentators on Buddhism dismissed that whole lot of the Buddhist scriptures. They dismissed everything about other beings. They dismissed the yakshas, they dismissed the devas. The Brahmas, the Muchalindas, all those magnificent beings were just rejected as kind of folklore, quote unquote, or untrue sort of additions to help people of a sort of lower intellect. That's the kind of assumption that was going around. But Panti brings it all back. He says, the universe is alive. And this is very, very important to Sangharakshita, to see the universe as alive, not as a dead, inert place. And that there's things in the universe that exist in ways we don't see or understand. And we are not the center of it. Existence doesn't take its existence from us. There's that beautiful line in his poem, Life is King, where he says, we belong to life. Life does not belong to us. So within this magnificent panorama of beings, yes, something unique can happen in human consciousness, but we are not the highest life form. We're not the only life form. We're not even the most, the most important, I suppose, the highest state of consciousness. There are other higher states of consciousness. Because his point is that if you limit existence to human beings kind of being on the top and being the kind of greatest consciousness that there is, there's no possibility of a higher state of consciousness. It puts a limitation onto the states of consciousness which we can achieve. We are it, you know, these deluded beings. And if you look at the state of the world, that's quite a depressing thought in a way, that human beings are the top form of consciousness, because we haven't done magnificently with the world that we live in. So yes, and it also puts a real limitation on your meditation practice in particular. If you think that this consciousness is the furthest that you can go, then how are you going to go into any higher states of consciousness? And all that devas are, those the gods and goddesses in Buddhism, they're objective manifestations of the subjective consciousness of dhyana, of those higher states of consciousness. So this magnificent panorama is saying, actually, there's further to go with states of consciousness. And not only if we completely dismiss the idea of devas, then we put a limit onto meditation, but we also limit the Buddha to just being a very, very special human being, you know, who's managed to get somewhere that very few people have. From the Buddhist point of view, the Buddha's attainment of enlightenment has significance not just for this world only, but for the whole cosmos, which is why he's called the teacher of gods and men. He surpassed any mundane form of consciousness, whether it's the normal human consciousness defined by greed, hatred, and delusion, or whether it's the consciousness of a deva, which is defined by higher states of dhyana. So yes, he's the teacher of gods and humans. The Buddha is in contact with all planes of being, all dimensions of reality. And his consciousness is not confined to the usual narrow range of human experience, nor is it confined to the higher states of consciousness of dhyana. So he's not a god and he's not a human. He's more than human. He's achieved something that's beyond all those states of consciousness. So, of course, there's that very famous story where someone sees the Buddha and he says to him, you know, what are you? Are you a god? Are you a deva? Are you a yaka, or kind of demonic being? Or are you human? And the Buddha says, I'm beyond all those categories, and I'm a teacher of all those categories. So yes, so the Buddha's consciousness is beyond even that magnificent panorama of many different types of beings. And section 4 blows your mind as to the universe and history. It blows your conception of time. So not only have we got an expanded context of this magnificent panorama of beings, we've also got an expanded perspective of universes coming in and out of existence, of matter evolving alongside devas becoming more embodied. So it's got this dual kind of movement of what he calls spiritual degeneration and material progress. So I'm going to share you a handout, which actually my trade drew out, and she's got a lot better handwriting than me, which isn't hard. So I'll just share that. Hopefully it's sharing okay. There it is. So you can see there, this on the one hand, you've got devas kind of emerging and becoming separated out from material evolution. And then you've got them coming together again. So there's this movement of mind and a movement of matter. Devas becoming separate from the world, and then the world coming back together with humans. So world coming back together with devas. It's all a little bit strange, I think, and all, particularly to a kind of Western scientific way of looking at things. And this happens also in these evolution and involution of world systems, happens in an inconceivably long period of time. So I can share this handout with you, so don't worry if you haven't quite absorbed it just now. Yeah. I think it's a little bit confusing because when he's talking about spiritual degeneration, so devas becoming more embodied alongside material progress, it's confusing because he means spiritual in a very specific sense here, which is that, as I said, devas are objective counterparts of the subjective mental states of dhyana. But when Bhante's talking about spiritual in this sense, he means spiritual in the sense of more subtle and refined mental states, dhyanic mental states. He doesn't mean the transcendental. So when we hear spiritual degeneration, we think, oh, that's terrible. Something really bad is happening alongside material evolution. We think, oh, that means that enlightenment's no longer possible. But actually, he's talking about something a little bit more complex than that, that Well, devas don't have transcendental insight. And the reason that they don't have transcendental insight is because if you are in a state of high dhyana and you're not reflecting on the nature of reality, it's very pleasant to stay there. If you're in the higher reaches of dhyana, there's no impetus to change. There's no impetus to do anything because it's such a supremely blissful experience. You could just sit there all day, every day. So in a way, what we need is we need a little bit of a rub. We need a little bit of a rub of dukkha. Because a mental state of dhyana isn't permanent. So yes, you can sit there all day, even in the arupa dhyanas, feeding on the bliss of dhyana. And then it ends because you're no longer kind of cultivating that positive mental state, you're just resting it. So for the Buddhist point of view, you need to be able to reflect on reality, and it's dukkha that's going to make you reflect on reality. It's a little bit of a rub, it's a little bit of suffering that will make you reflect on reality. So the embodiment of devas, the degeneration of devas that happens at the same time as matter's evolution is not a bad thing transcendentally speaking. In fact, there's a part of the Pali Canon where the devas talk about seeing the human world as heaven, because it's here that we can gain enlightenment, because there's enough joy and enough suffering to be able to really reflect on reality. Anyway, you can bring that up in the groups because it might be a bit more of a subtle point, but I suppose the sutta itself, where this kind of cosmic vision comes into, is explained, is not to be taken too literally as well. The Buddha's talking about a previous understanding of world systems, but he's making a very specific point. And the specific point he's making is that world systems come in and out of existence all the time. There's devas, there's humans, there's all kinds of beings coming in and out of existence. And the point of the Dharma is to be able to leave that kind of cosmic panorama, if you like, is to leave it completely, leave behind that cosmic drama. So when he's describing this cosmic vision, there's a refrain which is, the Dharma is the best thing for people in this life and the next as well. It's the Dharma that will make you free of those whole cycles of existence. So here we have this vision of the material universe consists of an infinity of world systems scattered throughout boundless space and coming into existence and passing away through beginningless and endless time. It's huge. It doesn't have a beginning. It doesn't have an end. And within that, beings evolve and they devolve. Matter is evolving and devolving. And there's a point where enlightenment is possible. And that point is when you're an embodied being, an embodied human being. And there's just enough suffering and just enough joy to be able to be liberated from that whole mass of samsara. And this is the difference between liberation and happiness. Happiness will be joining the Deva realm, what will be existing in higher states of blissful consciousness. Liberation is being free from it all. And the Buddha is free from it all. Where has he gone? He's the Sugata. Where has he gone in this cycle of existence? It's a mystery. He's beyond the realm of birth and death. The Buddha is the ocean crosser, gone beyond the ocean or the flood of birth and death, gone beyond the flood that sweeps you away, this frightening place of being, where you have no control. The Buddha is beyond all that. By what track can you lead him astray, the trackless one? So yes, section 5 and 6 are about blowing your mind about who the Buddha is and our own potential. So we need this expanded context, we need this expanded perspective, we need this enlarged sense of space and time. Because otherwise, if we have faith in the Buddha, we've got faith in the Buddha as just a rationalist or a reformer, a great ancient teacher, teaching the Dharma is a wonderful ancient philosophy developed in India 2,500 years ago. But, you know, still having something of relevance for us. We just think of the Buddha as a great thinker. But actually, the Buddha is much more than that. He's the rediscoverer of a path to liberation. He's the rediscoverer of that path out of samsara, out of this whole mass of suffering. And his Dharma is the path that leads to the timeless city of the Dharma, of reality itself, which is always true in any world system, for any being, at any time, in any space. And the Dharma is the way to realize the way things are, universal to all places and all times. It's not just an interesting philosophy that kind of happened in India 2,500 years ago. It's the means to enlightenment. It's the means to freedom from these, this world systems coming in and out of being with all these different beings. And there's a very beautiful part, I find, of section 5, where he's talking about the significance of the Buddha as the rediscoverer of the path to enlightenment. And even though enlightenment is enlightenment, and you know, whether you're the Buddha's disciple or the Buddha himself, he said that the experience is the same, that the disciples of the Buddha had such great devotion to the Buddha because they saw his significance, they saw what he'd really done, that he'd rediscovered this path to enlightenment, he'd hacked his way through that jungle of views and enabled others to come after him. You know, after a period of great darkness, when there was no means to enlightenment, he found it. He kept going until he found it. And he removed the obstacles for others so that they could also find it. So I think what you find with the disciples of the Buddha is that the closer to enlightenment they get, the more they realize the true significance of who the Buddha actually is. One of my favorite stories, amongst quite a large list of favorite stories, but one of my favorite is about Sariputta, who was one of the Buddha's chief disciples, of great wisdom, of sharp wisdom. And he knows that he's about to die. And he goes to the Buddha and asks his permission to enter his final parinibbana. And the Buddha says, well, do what you think it is time for. And they're both, well, I'm sort of edging towards elderly men at that time. They're both enlightened beings. They're both seen through into reality. And Sariputta goes to the Buddha and he prostrates himself at the Buddha's feet and embraces his legs. So you can imagine this, two enlightened beings, two elderly men. Sariputta, that great disciple of the Buddha who's led so many people towards enlightenment, a great teacher of the Dharma, embraces the Buddha's legs and says, so that I may worship at these feet have I fulfilled the 10 perfections through countless aeons. You know, there's something more that they saw about the Buddha. It wasn't just like, oh, well, you know, you're enlightened and I'm enlightened. They saw who he really was. And I find that deeply, deeply moving. Yeah, I find the relationship between Sariputta and the disciples of the Buddha and the Buddha himself deeply moving. So yes, it's not just, you know, Sangharakshita talks about the Dharma being the way, not just a way amongst ways, but the way to enlightenment. He's not just insisting on that about some kind of dogmatism. He's trying to say what the Dharma actually means. It's the definition of the Dharma itself is that which leads to enlightenment, that leads that timeless city. And maybe there's other ways to it too, but the Dharma is, that's what its sole purpose is. That's what it's actually about. That's what its definition is. It's the teaching which concerns itself with the conditions for Bodhi, for the transcendental. So we see the Buddha in the vastness of space and time. And what do we see? We see that the whole of space and time is conditioned by praticca, is governed by praticca samutpada, conditioned arising, including the Buddha's enlightenment itself. The attainment of enlightenment is a constantly recurring event in the universe. And the advent after the elapsing vast periods of time of an enlightened human being, an integral part of the structure and workings of phenomenal existence. When the conditions for the production of phenomena, from the falling of a leaf to the birth of a Buddha, are present, the effect will inevitably follow. So there's something about reality itself which contains the possibility of enlightenment. Within all this expanded space and time, within all samsara, there is the possibility for enlightened consciousness. And that means the Buddha, and that means you, and that means me. The human and historical biography of Gautama the Buddha is the story of the mystic marriage of the human and the divine, the individual and the universal, the terrestrial and the cosmic, the immanent urge and the transcendental ideal. So yes, there's this mystic marriage between the immanent urge and the transcendental ideal. There's the mystic marriage between the human being and the Buddha. And we are that mystic marriage. We also, just as the Buddha does, have a dual biography. And yes, we're a human being with all their conditioning and psychological complications, but we're also part of a universe where enlightenment is possible, and we are creating the conditions for enlightenment to arise. And you know, that's independent of whether you like that or not. If you practice the Dharma wholeheartedly, whatever you think about it, you are creating the conditions for a Buddha to arise, or for enlightenment, Bodhi, to arise. So we get the sense in these sections of a transcendental object, a mystery beyond any form of existence, beyond the known, beyond world systems coming in and out of existence, beyond the flood of existence, beyond devas and matter and evolutions and involutions, beings rising and falling. The Buddha himself, he says, well, when he was enlightened, just before his enlightenment, he saw this whole vast kind of panorama of existence. He saw universes coming in and out of existence. He saw himself within that, and he saw all beings within that. And then he knew that he was free. So there we go, the transcendental object, free of all the, free of samsara. But we also need to understand that we ourselves have got to get a glimmer of ourselves even as a transcendental subject. I am more than I think I am. There's this wonderful sutta in the Itivuttaka where the Buddha says, "Bhikkhus, I am ever accessible to entreaties. Open-handed, I bear my last body. I am the supreme physician, the supreme surgeon. You are the children of my breast, born of my mouth, born of the Dhamma, fashioned by Dhamma, heirs of Dharma, not heirs of material things." You know, in the end, the Dharma, the spiritual life, the Dharma life has to be lived. And it has to be lived within us, in who we are. It has to be manifested within us as human beings. So yes, we have this transcendental object, the possibility of Buddhahood that's always present as a potential in the universe. And we have ourselves, and somehow this mystic marriage has to take place. In the flux of existence, we're there on our journey towards enlightenment, arising from the mud like lotuses. And we have that beautiful story of the Buddha seeing all beings like lotuses emerging from the mud of existence towards their true potential, which is enlightenment. And it's said that when the Buddha saw this, he shook, the Anukampa, he shook with all beings. And still, even with a sense of transcendental object and subject, there's still further to go. Because section 7 blows our mind as to what the Dharma is and where it comes from. So there's a very interesting quote from Bhante, not in the survey, but he says we mustn't forget that to see reality in all things in the universe isn't enough. To see reality everywhere isn't enough. Though it's the profoundest spiritual experience, in a way it isn't complete. There also needs to be that mutual recognition and enjoyment between, as it were, creative individuals, or at the highest level between enlightened beings. So I think this is what section 7 is about. It's not enough just to gain enlightenment, you have to communicate it. You have to have that mutual recognition. And the Buddha had to communicate what he'd learned. Not even what he'd learned, but what he'd rediscovered, the truth that he'd seen about reality. And he wasn't just sort of building on other people's philosophies. He was using the tools available to him at the time to communicate the transcendent, to communicate what was beyond expression, what was beyond words and concepts. And I know that I myself, and maybe a few of you, have made the actual physical journey from Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha was enlightened, to Sarnath, where the Buddha taught the Dharma. It's actually quite a long way if you walked it, which I haven't. I went in a car and it took 4 hours. The Buddha walked it, in the heat as well. But I think that journey, there's a literal journey, but I think there's also a kind of metaphorical journey, in a sense that the Buddha gained enlightenment and then he walked all that way to the best people he could think of to teach enlightenment. And that was a journey for him. And I think in a way that was an unfolding of his enlightenment as well. And he used the contemporary language, he used contemporary ideas and practices to see if they worked. So there's this expression, new wine in old bottles. He had to use, there was this transcendent insight beyond words and concepts, but he had to use words and concepts to actually explain it. And he was limited by the language available to him at the time. And he was limited by the framework of thinking of the people who came to him. The main part of his teaching took place with wanderers who already had ideas about what the spiritual life was about. People like Vajratara, who was concerned with, is the universe finite or infinite? He tried to use terms such as Brahmin. He even tried to use magical powers. And it was a combination of what Bhante calls spiritual pragmatism and transcendental empiricism that allowed his teaching to develop. So spiritual pragmatism is when he took practices that were available to him at the time to see if they worked before his enlightenment. He saw that things such as ascetic practices didn't work. He saw that practices such as the mindfulness of breathing did work. So there's spiritual pragmatism, trying things and seeing if they work. And then there's transcendental empiricism, which is that when he was actually enlightened, he could see directly whether things worked. He could see what were the tendencies towards human beings and seeing how they could be helped. So we have this image of the seed in the pot. There's the seed of the timeless Dhamma, beyond this flux of samsara, in the pot, in the soil of the teachings and practices of ancient India, and using the language and culture of the time, using the environment around the Buddha. But the source itself of the Dharma is transcendent and timeless. It's beyond space, beyond time. But, the Buddha had to use what was available to him. And there was evident satisfaction and rejoicing when people did understand. The nature of enlightenment was to communicate, is to have a kind of what Bhante calls a vital mutual responsiveness. And it's the same with us. The spiritual life is there to be shared. It's not something that we keep to itself, because by its very nature, it's expanding us beyond the limitations of self and other. And of course, this is what Bhante also had to do. He had the seed of something, a seed of something magical and timeless and beyond space and something mysterious and transcendent. And he had to use the contemporary culture that he found himself in the 60s in India, in the UK, and in the 50s in India, in fact. He had to use what was available to him in order to communicate the Dharma. And it was a culture around him that helped him create the movement. You know, in the UK, it was the 1960s and people were very open to Eastern traditions. They were quite open to a lot of things that weren't so helpful, but there was a kind of a spiritual exploration of the time. And in India, you had the teachings of Dr. Ambedkar, which had great similarities to some of Bhante's teachings, where Dr. Ambedkar, also had embraced Buddhism and saw the value of Buddhism and saw the effect that Buddhism could have on the world. And people were very receptive to Buddhism through Dr. Ambedkar. Well, still are. And you also had the culture of the Tibetans coming through into Kalimpong when Bhante was living there. So he had all these things that he was working with, all these ideas and practices that he'd been given, that he was using to create the movement that we now have. He sometimes said, well, maybe he had to create the movement, set up the movement at that time in the UK, then and there, or not at all. So yes, we're not trying to transplant a different cultural form of Buddhism whole into modern Western culture or modern Indian culture or modern global culture. We're not trying to just transplant Buddhism unchanged. And we're not just trying to harvest Buddhism, where we just take bits from here and there, taking the bits we like and which conform to our culture and leaving behind the bits we don't like. We're trying to take the seed of the Dharma and see how that emerges in our culture. And what that means is actually practicing it, is taking the Dharma from all those different traditions, putting them into a real living practice and seeing how the Dharma takes expression in our culture, in our time. And to do that means we actually need to change in the light of the Dharma. So yes, these chapters are about the Buddha in an expanded context and an expanded perspective, but they're also about us and seeing ourselves within an expanded perspective and in an expanded context, and to not limit ourselves by our current state of consciousness. So I'm just going to finish by reading one of my favorite readings from the Shikshu Samuchaya by Shantideva, which is from the Ratnakaranda Sutra. So it's an extract from a different sutra, which I think has been lost now. Anyway, he says, truly, O Manjushri, a tiny sparrow emerging from the membrane of an egg, without the shell fully broken, and without stepping out of the egg, utters just a sparrow's cry. Even so, Manjushri, a bodhisattva wrapped in the membrane of ignorance, without breaking the delusion of self or stepping out of the triple world, utters the cry of a Buddha, the cry of shunyata, unconditioned and unconfined. And this is us, this is you and me, despite all our manifest imperfections. There's something in us that utters the cry of a Buddha, the cry of shunyata, unconditioned and unconfined.